Okay, we're back along the Croatian Adriatic coast, and after a couple of episodes on Istria, we are heading south. While it's not a huge distance from Istria to Zadar as the EasyJet flies, it's one of the larger gaps we've left out, but please don't hate. The TLDR is there's not any huge or massively significant Venetian towns along this stretch. The most significant city by far is Rijeka, which joins a rather tiny club, mainly consisting of Trieste and Dubrovnik, of towns the Venetians could not successfully hold in the Adriatic. Rijeka became a staunch holdout for the Habsburgs, which alleviates my guilt for not having been. And while there are things I would like to see in Nin and Novigrad, as far as Venetian architecture goes, they are eclipsed, dwarfed in fact, by Zadar. In opening, I will say, very fond of Zadar, had a great time there, watched the travel episode, but truthfully, I found most of the other Venetian towns along this route much more immersive than Zadar. Šibenik coming next time, for example, much easier to lose yourself in, figuratively and very literally. Zadar is not helped by having received an absolute thrashing from Allied bombs during World War II, suffering somewhere between 30 to 50 raids. In light of which, it's a minor miracle that anything has survived, least of all this gorgeous Carolingian-era church from the 800s, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. All this is not to say that Zadar is insignificant. In fact, its surviving Venetian defences form part of the UNESCO inscription on the Venetian works of defence between the 16th and 17th centuries. This is a bit of a funny one. I'm not sure how much to expand on it here and now. Just briefly, considering we're going on a rampage through every Venetian fortified town we can get to, it's nice to see their legacy get appreciated. But the UNESCO inscription is... it's a little choosy. It picks 6 sites which make up a random spread, 3 in Italy, 2 in Croatia and 1 in Montenegro. Now, UNESCO is famously selective about sites it will permit, so it's considered a real honour if your sites are selected. But, well, for me at least, it's hard to see why they couldn't have cast the net a little wider. I mean, case in point, the fort at Nafplio, Methone, or even Acrocorinth, which is slightly more ruinous. These are all incredibly significant. I mean, Spinalonga on Crete from a couple of episodes back gets its own inscription. The above, with a few others, are on a tentative list submitted in 2014. All I'm saying, it's a bit of an odd group to select, even geographically. We'll maybe talk about it more when we've covered a few more of these. Well, when we arrived in Zadar, one of the first things we did, we climbed the bell tower to get a better look at Zadar, perhaps feeling the Assassin's Creed need to synchronise the minimap for the area. Though, when I say climb, I do mean using the stairs, not like parkouring up the side. The original Venetian tower, completed in 1452, was not as tall. You can get it confused when you look from the Forum, but this is not the campanile for this church, but in fact for the cathedral behind. We do need to take a moment up. Can't skip over this, even though it's a church which is distinctly not Venetian. If anything, it's even more remarkable. It's the Church of St. Donatus, and it dates in its earliest foundation to the late 700s, early 800s. And it was during this time that much of what is now Croatia and the Dalmatian coast came under the control of Charlemagne and the Carolingians. And this church, with its round shape, does have certain hallmarks of Frankish churches from around this time. Perhaps we're drifting off topic here, but churches from the 800s in this part of the world and surviving in this size and condition, it's practically a unicorn. The Venetians used it as a warehouse, apparently. Geez, guys, maybe I should thank you for not flattening it, but really? I think this is going to require a quick segment on the history of Zadar. A lot of the main characters in this account are similar to those who had a starring role in the cities of Istria. Also, like the Istrian cities, Zadar was a major Roman port, part of the Illyrian conquests from the mid-100s BC. The Roman city was known as Larda, and most of the medieval period it was known as Zara. We're just going to keep calling it Zadar, even in antiquity, to just avoid the confusion. Like every city along the Dalmatian coast, it bore the scars of some major destruction events over subsequent centuries. Attacks by the Huns in the mid-400s, a period of control by the Ostrogothic kingdom for several decades after that, a major earthquake in the mid-500s, and after that, attacks by Avars and Slavs made Zadar one of the few safe havens in the region for the next 100 or so years. It's at this point that the question of authority becomes really muddy. We are really short on written sources for this period in this part of the world. We have a reference to an Archon of Dalmatia in a list from 842, which does point to the idea that the Byzantines are trying to make a go of it. And with Salona, which had previously been the most significant Roman city in Dalmatia, now ruined and abandoned, it was Zadar that became the seat of this theoretical Byzantine control in 869. So the idea of Roman control continuing here is in the background, but the very prosaic needs to be fed and protected were noticeably not being met by Constantinople. And in part of the world where raids from both the mainland and piracy were a perennial threat, the city-states had to be suitably self-sufficient to survive. Now, we haven't got time here to discuss the relationship with the emerging Croat kingdom because that topic is a large, unruly pile of known unknowns. It's just really hard to characterise. It's best summarised that the coastal towns like Zadar, Trogir and others are on quite a different trajectory from the Croat-speaking population on the mainland. But into this often volatile and uncertain period, the Venetian anti-piracy campaigns in the Adriatic began in earnest at the turn of the 1000s. Piracy had for too long been threatening their bottom line, and nothing motivated Venice quite like the loss of trade revenue. But funding a major naval policing expedition like this is not cheap, and Venice looked to expand what amounts to its protection racket on a more formal basis with the Dalmatian cities that stood to benefit from piracy being eradicated. It was true that Zadar had appealed to Venice for help prior to this campaign, but the Venetian fleet that landed was a lot more than the Dalmatian cities were expecting. After this campaign, Doge Pietro II Orseolo awarded himself the title of Dux Dalmatiae, or the Duke of Dalmatia, making it implicit that Venice now considered themselves masters of the region. To be honest, Zadar, perhaps more than any other city on the Dalmatian coast, refutes the idea that all the cities just rolled over to Venetian control. I say any city, maybe except Dubrovnik, they actually successfully pulled off being independent from Venice. Watch the history video we did. But almost immediately, Zadar appears to have wanted out of this Faustian bargain. The sheer number of attempts Zadar made to wrestle away from Venetian control. First, starting in around the 1030s, the Venetians under Doge Contarini made an expedition and recaptured Zadar in 1062. Then the city negotiated with the Byzantines to be incorporated into the Croat state around 1069, but even as the Croat crown became part of the crown of Hungary, Zadar was constantly attacked by Venice, who doggedly refused to let this crucial foothold in the Adriatic slip away. Truthfully, Zadar was significant enough a port to be a commercial rival to Venice in the region. While they were semi-content to come under the cover of Hungary, this seems to be born not out of any fondness for the Hungarians, but the desire for autonomy, to which Venice was the greatest threat. Further Venetian conflicts came all through the 1100s. It's perhaps little wonder that after such a long period of resistance that the Venetians turned to increasingly drastic means, and sadly one of Zadar's claims to fame is the first bloody chapter in one of the absolute low points of medieval Christianity. The Fourth Crusade is going to require much more context and broader discussion, but in short, the Venetians convinced a large proportion of a Crusader force, originally assembled with the goal of attacking Muslim Egypt, to instead sack Zadar as a down payment for all the ships Venice had constructed. Now, that's missing quite a lot of background, but it meant that a huge Christian army claiming to be on a holy war showed up at the walls of Zadar in 1202 and sacked another Christian city, pillaging the town as an errand for cash. It's hard not to look at this as anything but utterly disgraceful. Even the Pope, Innocent III, who was no stranger to massacring fellow Christians after sanctioning the Albigensian Crusade, another absolutely horrific bloodbath that Catholic Europe inflicted on itself, he condemned the attack and excommunicated the Crusaders. But I'm not going to attempt a two sides to this. It's just appalling. But believe it or not, that was not the end of Zadar's resistance to Venice. Numerous conflicts over the next 150 years, all of which played into some larger tug of war between Venice and Hungary, and culminated in a 16-month Venetian siege of Zadar between 1345 and 1346. And yet, even after the Venetians had for the umpteenth time retaken the city, just 12 years later, the Treaty of Zadar forced Venice into a humiliating climb down, rescinding all of their Dalmatian holdings as far south as the Bay of Kotor, leaving them only Istria and their holdings on what is now the Italian mainland. But, oh, nope. Still not the end of the story. Venice would be preoccupied with a costly war with the Genoese in the meantime, but by the early 1400s, Hungary itself would be embroiled in bloody internal conflicts, and in 1409, Dalmatia, and Zadar with it, were sold back to Venice for 100,000 ducats. Now, while Zadar was still less than willing to be subject to Venice, a purge of noble families and their property seems to have finally subdued the city as a permanent Venetian possession, and it became the administrative centre for Dalmatia. So with all that background, returning to a tour of the city, behind the campanile where we started, this is the Cathedral of St. Anastasia. The cathedral has very early origins as a basilica from the 300s. However, the siege and subsequent sack of Zara by the Venetians in the Fourth Crusade made sure it got pretty wrecked and needed considerable rebuilding. You can see the spectacular facade here, completed in 1324 with some lovely Romanesque work. We've got more bits to see in the town centre, but I feel bad not reverting to discussing the walls. They are one of, perhaps the most significant legacy of the Venetians here. Motivated by a prolonged series of Ottoman assaults in the 1500s, the Venetians had not only worked hard to control Zadar, but they were equally determined to keep it. And with the Ottoman forces in control of the mainland opposite, a 40-year building program turned Zadar into an actual island, cutting a channel just in front of what is now the land gate. However, viewing the city now, in parts the walls are sometimes obscured or just missing, and so without a concerted look, it's not instantly apparent what's happening. So first things first, not all of it is here. Zadar joins a list of many of the great cities from antiquity who made it to the 19th century, only to decide their seawalls should be demolished or generally despoiled. See also Thessaloniki, Constantinople. The march of progress meant that these were invariably replaced with large open esplanades by the water. So what would have been the southwestern side of Zadar's circuit of defences are sadly nowhere to be seen. However, its landward northeastern side is largely intact. You can see this long span of walls. At the top is the Chain Bastion, then the St. Dimitri Wall, at which point you get to the main gate of interest on the northeastern section, the Sea Gate, or St. Chrysogonus Gate. Built in 1573 as a celebration of the Battle of Lepanto, it actually incorporates part of a Roman triumphal arch in its construction. Then in the middle is the Sea Bastion, followed by the King Tomislav Bastion, then a huge projecting portion, the Grimani Bastion, which is all very pretty and green, though the trees do make photographing the overall form of it much harder. And at this point, just impossible to talk about Zadar without mentioning the land gate. It's quite something. As an icon of the Venetian legacy in Dalmatia, this is hard to beat. Built in 1543 by Michele San Michele, who, by the way, was responsible for much of the fortification work at Zadar, as well as the fortifications of Hania on Crete. Though nowadays it's noticeably on the narrow side for a gate, perhaps surprisingly, road traffic does still pass through here. We'll have more on this in Lion Watch, but just a footnote. Despite how gorgeous it looks from the outside, as you pass through it, if you turn around, you are greeted with this rather jarring wall of cement. I'm not exactly sure which decade this addition can be blamed on, but, well, it's not great, is it? While we're loitering at the southern extent of the walls, just inside the land gate, the space opens out into a rather beautiful five-well square, and you can get a better look at the Captain's Tower, a pentagonal tower built in the 1500s. This is actually one of many. As you can see from earlier depictions of the city, it was formerly ringed with towers, but this is the only military tower to survive. You can also see some of Zadar's earlier defences, in rather stark contrast to the stocky Venetian walls. There's several layers on display here. You can see different courses of masonry, including Roman layers, shorn up by early medieval layers, and even some of the wall from the 1200s. While the main island ends here, what is now an asphalt road was formerly a wooden drawbridge. Round to the left, there is a nice footpath where you can still enjoy the stretch of sea walls that faces southeast, and this comes to a halt just as you round the southern corner here. However, don't make the mistake that that's the extent of the Venetian defences of Zadar. Because it's been turned into a public park filled with trees, it's not obvious what you're looking at, but this is the Forte Fortress. Yeah, that name's not going to get confusing at all. Built between 1566 and 1569, they had to destroy an entire suburb to make space for it. It covers the city walls at the Landgate side and then extends around a considerable span. If you head south to find Oh look, say it with me now, a car park. No way. This view gives you a slightly better idea of what's happening. When you're standing on the main road on the northern side of Zadar, it's not instantly obvious that the city walls have stopped and a new section has started, but again, you can see how the forte projects firepower away from the main city walls, such that even if you've taken that, you're still faced with overpowering the Grimani bastion and the walls of the city itself. Clever stuff. Quick digression, I know it's not Venetian, but there's a similar design at Valletta in Malta. Valletta is on a promontory, and while the main town itself is a bastion fortress, it throws up an additional obstacle to would-be invaders from the landward side in the form of Floriana, which is now a rather quiet neighbourhood with some somewhat derelict-looking defences, but at the very least it survived, and it's an excellent example of this form of artillery fortification. Back to Zadar, you can pass through this gateway in the southern side of the forte. In the centre, there's a well to supply water for the garrison in the event of a siege. Dipping back inside the city, even if fragmentary, there's numerous Roman ruins that we're not really attending to, at least not in this episode. In the Roman Forum, there's the impressive Benedictine monastery of St. Mary, founded in around 1066. It had to be almost completely rebuilt after the Allied bombing of World War II. So while you can see a number of Romanesque features, I can't say for sure how close this is to the previous, but looking at this postcard from 1909, it looks like the restoration was pretty faithful. To the north corner of the town, there's the Arsenal and Small Arsenal. The large arsenal is now an events venue, built in the 1500s and expanded in 1752, as per the inscription on the front. Sorry about the harsh light. Just opposite, the small arsenal is actually a remnant from an internal fortified space that is now mostly lost. Looking back at my footage, I almost ended up confusing this with the cathedral. There is a gorgeous Romanesque church of St. Crishevan, or Chrysonegus, depending on which language, consecrated in 1175, so a little earlier than the full Venetian control of the town. A bell tower was added in 1475, but they never fully finished it, hence it doesn't really join the others, clearly visible in the skyline of Zadar. It just barely rises above the height of the church itself. St. Simeon's Church is striking, thanks to the orange paint added in the 1980s. The Baroque church itself is from the 1600s. I didn't go inside, but apparently if you do and attempt to take pictures, you will be vigorously pounced on. Nearby, the Narodny Square, it has some Venetian structures, such as this loggia, but it has been updated a lot. I mean, the bell tower, for example, is an Austrian edition from 1798. Last thing, just a little footnote. A short way out of the city, this is the Imperial Fountain. It was built in 1546 and was used to draw water for the local population as well as passing ships. It's pretty, but as you can see, its dome has been redone in concrete, which does take away from its elegance, and nowadays it more just blends into the promenade of the waterfront. So that's Zadar. It's a funny contrast that while it has so much from the Venetian era and earlier, post-war rebuilding does make it feel much more like a modern city, the waterfront and the modern city blocks around the Forum in particular. But with Zadar done, that means it's time for Lion Watch, and oh boy, there's a lot for a city only a couple of square kilometres wide. In no particular order, the lion at the Sea Gate is impressively large, though kind of worse for wear, so not a huge amount to say about that. This is on the small arsenal. It's uncanny in ways that are hard to pin down. I think it's the L'Oreal hair. Rather than a mane sort of spreading out across its whole scalp, it just has these long, luscious human hairs that just oozing with vitality, and not a single grey. If you follow the seawall around the southeast corner, this one is kind of up high facing the sea. I know it's missing part of its face, but it pretty much just gives the impression it's been punched, like the expression of one of those Looney Tunes punches where your face gets caved all the way in. This very Wizard of Oz-esque cowardly lion is randomly protruding from a house inside a street within the city. Just a fascinatingly unconvincing lion all round. There's this well in the Forte Fort. It is, of course, very corroded, but you can see from the shape it's a bit too snaky, kind of like a big eel with furry legs and other appendages. This one just looks embarrassed, like it didn't see on the group chat that everyone was doing Secret Santa, so he's just about to hand someone this book and pretend he hadn't forgot to get a present. And the one you've all been waiting for, got to point out, there are additional lions on the land gate. They're not bad. A bit pointy-headed, but they're like, okay, we've fetched this oversized ring for you, now what's happening? Okay, this is a pretty good line. At which point everyone's like, well, egg all over your face, you always do this segment to say how inaccurate the Venetian lines are, and now here's a good one. To which I hold up this photograph. What do I always say? Okay, actually, this is only episode 5, so I've maybe said it, twice. If it looks really good, it's almost certainly been restored. And if you look back at this black and white photo, you could see the face had got mashed. And actually, yeah, when you look up close, it's pretty clear, like, oh yeah, the whole face is far more crisp. So yes, it's good because it had help. And yeah, look, great. I mean, this is hands down, no contest, the best so far, and probably the best we'll see anywhere in Croatia. So we'll be back on our way down the coast with Šibenik coming next. That's going to be a good one. Please do take a look around at some of the other episodes in the playlist. It'll give you a lot more background on what we're talking about, and it also just really helps us out, along with subscribing and following us on socials. And if you've been enjoying the music in the background, we like all the music for these episodes. We've gone to the trouble of actually visiting and filming all these places rather than just stitching them together out of some unrelated stock footage. It's been a huge job, and we've still got a lot more to do, but it's not cheap, it all adds up. So if you're happy to support the channel, flick us a few quid on bandcamp.com. We've got an increasingly large discography on there, and that would mean a huge amount. Otherwise, we'll be back with the Šibenik episode very soon.